The Siege of Tuyen Quang was an important confrontation between the French and the Chinese armies in Tonkin during the Sino-French War. A French garrison of 630 men, including 2 companies of the French Foreign Legion, successfully defended the French post of Tuyen Quang against vastly superior Chinese forces in a 4-month siege from the 24th of November 1884 to the 3rd of March 1885. Tuyen Quang 1885 remains one of the Legion's proudest battle honors. Background: the French installed a post at Tuyen Quang in June 1884, in the wake of their capture of Hung Hoa and Tai Nguyen. Tuyen Quang, an isolated settlement on the Clear River, was the most westerly French outpost in Tonkin, and was 80 kilometers from the nearest French post at Fudon. During the summer and autumn of 1884 it was garrisoned by 2 companies of the 1st Battalion, 1st Foreign Legion Regiment, under the command of Chef de Bataillon Frogger. The outbreak of the Sino-French War on 23 August 1884 exposed the post to attack by Tang Jingsong's Yunnan Army and Liu Yongfu's Black Flags. Supply difficulties delayed the Chinese concentration around Tuyen Quang, but advance elements of the Yunnan Army began to harass the post in October 1884, and Frogger's garrison had to fight off a number of nuisance attacks by the Chinese. Malaria had also taken a heavy toll of Frogger's men, and by the end of October 170 men out of the garrison's total strength of 550 men were unfit for duty. In November 1884, General Louis Briere de Lisle, the commander of the Tonkin Expeditionary Corps, took steps to resupply and reinforce Hung Hoa, Tai Nguyen and Tuyen Quang. On 19 November a column making for Tuyen Quang under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Jacques Duchesne was ambushed in the Uoc Gorge by the Black Flags but was able to fight its way through to the beleaguered post. Frogger and his men were relieved, and replaced by a fresh garrison of 400 legionnaires and 160 Tonkinese riflemen under the command of Chef de Bataillon Marc-Edmond Dominé of the 2nd African Light Infantry Battalion. Duchesne left Tuyen Quang on 23 November, and on the following day Dominé formally declared Tuyen Quang to be in a state of siege. The Siege of Tuyen Quang would last for just over 4 months. Forces involved: the new garrison of Tuyen Quang, just under 630 men strong, consisted of 2 companies of the 1st Battalion, 1st Foreign Legion Regiment under the overall command of Captain Catalin, a company of Tonkinese riflemen under the command of the French Marine Infantry officer Captain Deer, a scratch battery of 6 light cannon and small engineering and field hospital detachments. The garrison was supported by the Farsi gunboat mitrailleurs, at anchor in the Clear River close to the French post. The Chinese army besieging Tuyen Quang was under the overall command of Tang Jingsong. The Chinese forces consisted of 9,000 men of the Yunnan Army and 3,000 men of Liu Yongfu's Black Flag Army. The Yunnan Army forces were divided into 2 divisions, commanded by Tang's lieutenants Ding Huai and He Ziyulan. The fortress of Tuyen Quang. The French fortress at Tuyen Quang was typical of the small, remote outposts of France's colonial empire. Lying on the western bank of the Clear River next to the Tonkinese village of Tuyen Quang, it consisted of a square masonry citadel, each of whose walls was 300 yards long. Inside the citadel's perimeter were several barrack buildings, a lake and a large earthen mound in the shape of a sugar loaf. This hill, which looked just like a natural formation, took the place at Tuyen Quang of the tower traditionally found in Tonkinese citadels. The citadel was overlooked by a number of wooded hills, which the Chinese were bound to occupy. There was little Dominé could do to stop Chinese snipers from using these hills to fire down into the citadel, but he could at least delay the main enemy assault by building outworks to keep the Chinese at a respectable distance from the main perimeter. Accordingly, he had a blockhouse built on a hill 300 meters to the south of the citadel, which was occupied by a strong force of legionnaires. This position, centered on a fortified pagoda on the river bank, was christened Little Gibraltar. These positions could be evacuated if necessary, and as long as they held they would severely limit the pressure the Chinese could exert on the fortress itself. The investment. In November 1884, the Yunnan Army gradually advanced down the Red River from Lao Cai towards Tuyen Quang, building a chain of entrenched camps at Pho En, Man Lan, Ao Loc, Van Kiang and Sun Long. In December the Chinese built 3 enormous fortified camps as bases for the Siege of Tuyen Quang, at Than Quan, California Lan and Phu En Bin. For much of this period the only enemy troops around Tuyen Quang were Lu Yongfu's Black Flags in an advance guard of the Yunnan Army under Tang Jingsong's personal command. The Chinese investment of the French post only began to bite in the second half of December. By the beginning of January 1885 the Chinese had 4,000 men facing the French at Tuyen Quang, 5,000 men protecting their long and vulnerable supply line back to Lao Cai, and 3,000 men deployed between Tuyen Quang and Phu Don, who were busy fortifying a strong blocking position at Hoa Moc. The besiegers gradually drew their lines closely around the French post at Tuyen Quang, occupying the villages of Phu En Bin, Dong Yen and Ya Ho to the west of the fortress and Yla, Ung Dai and Trong Mu to the northwest. The siege. On the 31st of December 1884 the Chinese launched an initial attack, which was repelled with losses. They attacked again on the 10th of January and the 26th of January 1885, but with no more success. But at the same time they had diverted more than 1,000 men to work on digging saps in order to approach the walls of the fortress from the southwest and the north simultaneously. On the 27th of January their trenches were less than 1,000 meters from the French walls, and they began to sap towards the blockhouse. As its communications with the citadel were threatened, the blockhouse had to be abandoned on the 30th of January. The guns which Domine had at his disposal were of too low a caliber to do any serious damage to the enemy trenches. The Chinese converted the abandoned French blockhouse into a fortified position for a battery of 4 cannon and drew their encirclement of the French post closer. From then on, attacks were made on the French positions almost daily and the defenders were subjected to an almost continual barrage of cannon, mortar and rifle fire from all sides. The French did what they could to respond. Domine posted 25 crack Legion marksmen on the citadel's watchtowers with orders to fire at Chinese soldiers working as laborers on the approach saps, in order to disrupt the progress of the Chinese siege works. The Legion snipers normally took 9 or 10 victims a day, and by the end of the siege estimated that they had accounted for over 700 enemy soldiers. Domine occasionally brought his own artillery into play, and the gunboat mitrailleurs harassed the Chinese positions on the Clear River with Hoshka's fire. The Chinese responded by deploying their own snipers on hill positions around the French post. They rarely hit their targets, but the weight of plunging fire they were able to bring to bear severely restricted movement inside the fortress. Having successfully forced the French from the outlying blockhouse by siege tactics, the Chinese sapped relentlessly towards the French perimeter wall. If they could mine the walls and collapse sections of the defense perimeter, they could bring their superior numbers to bear by assaulting the French through open breaches. The Chinese intentions were obvious, and the French engineering sergeant Jules Beaubillet did his best to frustrate them. Both the French and the Chinese feverishly dug galleries and counter-galleries. On the 11th of February a pickaxe blow severed the membrane which separated a French from a Chinese miner, and an underground revolver fight took place. The French tried vainly to flood the Chinese saps, which were lower than theirs. On the evening of the 12th of February the first Chinese mine was exploded beneath the perimeter wall, but its effect was weakened by the counter-galleries and a subsequent Chinese assault was repelled with heavy losses. Another mine, which exploded on the 13th of February, made a 15-meter breach in the southwest wall of the citadel. Captain Moulin rushed to the threatened point with his company, halted an enemy attack, and threw the assailants back to their forward trenches. The body of a French legionnaire was thrown onto the enemy parapets by the force of the explosion, and on the following night Corporal Bulin of the Legion took a party of 3 soldiers to go out into no man's land and recover it. On the 17th of February the Chinese brought up fresh guns, and the bombardment now continued without a pause. Most of the buildings became uninhabitable, and the French had to abandon them and live in foxholes. Supplies of cigarettes had by now run out, trying the defenders' nerves still further. Sleep became increasingly difficult, and in daytime most French soldiers not on duty at the perimeter wall were busy digging additional inner defenses. Domine had a redoubt built in the southeast corner of the fortress, where a final stand could be made if the Chinese carried the perimeter walls by assault. At 7 a.m. on the 22nd of February the Chinese delivered their 4th assault. After exploding a mine and making a feint attack to draw the defenders onto the breach, they exploded a second mine under them which killed 12 legionnaires and wounded 20 more. Captain Moulin, the ranking officer, and Second Lieutenant Vincent were both killed in the explosion. The Chinese then charged across the open breach. They were thrown back by a counter-charge led by Commandant Domine in person. Meanwhile, the Chinese exploded a third mine under another section of the perimeter which collapsed almost 60 yards of wall. This explosion was the signal for a Chinese general assault. Hundreds of Chinese soldiers poured out of their trenches and advanced towards the 2 gaping breaches in the French defences. But the French had now recovered from the shock of the second mine, and drove them back with relative ease. A 5th Chinese assault was delivered on the 24th of February, and a 6th on the 25th of February. Like their predecessors, both assaults were decisively repulsed. But although the garrison had beaten off 6 attempts to storm its positions, it had lost over a third of its strength, sustaining a heroic defense against overwhelming odds. By the end of February it was clear that Tuyen Quang would fall unless it was relieved immediately. The relief. During January and February 1885 the besiegers were able to place enormous pressure on the garrison because the bulk of the Tonkin Expeditionary Corps was committed to the Lang Son campaign. However, the capture of Lang Son on 13 February 1885 allowed the French to come to the relief of Tuyen Quang. General Brière de Lisle personally led Lieutenant Colonel Laurent Giovanni Nally's 1st Brigade back to Hanoi, and then upriver to the relief of Tuyen Quang. The brigade, reinforced at Phu Don on 24 February by a small column from Hung Hoa under the command of Lieutenant Colonel de Mauchin, found the route to Tuyen Quang blocked by a strong Chinese defensive position at Hoa Moc. On 2 March 1885 Giovanni Nally attacked the left flank of the Chinese defensive line. The Battle of Hoa Moc was the most fiercely fought action of the Sino-French War. 2 French assaults were decisively repulsed, and although the French eventually stormed the Chinese positions, they suffered heavy casualties. Nevertheless, their costly victory cleared the way to Tuyen Quang. The Yunnan Army and the Black Flags raised the siege and drew off to the west, and the relieving force entered the beleaguered post on the afternoon of 3 March. 3 days earlier, on 28 February, the Chinese had made a 7th and final assault on the Tuyen Quang perimeter, knowing that the relief column was close and that it would be their last chance to capture the post. The Chinese attacked with fanatical courage but once again failed to force the breach. On 2 March the men of the Tuyen Quang garrison listened anxiously to the sounds of rifle and cannon fire from the Uoc Gorge, where the 1st Brigade was fighting to break through to the beleaguered post. Hopes of relief faded as the sounds of battle continued well into the night. It seemed all too likely that Giovanni Nally's men had been halted by the Black Flags. On the morning of the 3rd of March, to their amazement, the defenders awoke to find that the Chinese had abandoned the siege. Domine sent out fighting patrols to scout the enemy trenches. The last French fatality of the siege was suffered during a skirmish with a small Chinese rearguard. Legionnaire Strebler saw a Chinese soldier sighting on Captain de Borelli and threw himself between the two men. Strebler was killed instantly by the bullet intended for his captain. The incident, unsurprisingly, haunted de Borelli for the rest of his life. Several years later he made what amends he could by publishing a moving poem to the Fellowship of the French Foreign Legion, Amis hommes qui sont morts. The arrival of the relief column on the afternoon of the 3rd of March was greeted with jubilation by the defenders. Captain Jean-François Alphonse Lecomte, who had marched with Giovanni Nolly's brigade, recorded the encounter between Captain de Borelli and General Briere de Lisle. "We approached the fortress. At the head of a group of officers we saw a captain with a long white beard, who was flourishing his cane and dancing an impromptu jig. The first man he met in the relief column was a bugler. He threw his arms around him. Then he embraced the second bugler. The band tried to keep its dignity, but to no avail. He then abandoned the buglers and fell on the neck of the first drummer. Then he made for the general-in-chief. There was a sudden hush, as when an orchestra falls silent at the end of a dance. He recovered himself, solemnly clicked his heels, and saluted General Briere de Lisle. We recognized Captain de Borelli. Good afternoon, Captain. How are you? We're delighted to see you, indeed. Me too. Especially as I only just escaped being killed this morning. Casualties. The casualties of the Tuyen Quang garrison during the siege were 50 dead and 224 wounded. The dead included the engineering sergeant Jules Beaubillet, whose energetic countermeasures had delayed the progress of the Chinese siege works. Beaubillet became a national hero in France after his death, and streets in many French towns and villages still bear his name. Casualties in Giovanni Nolly's 1st Brigade at the Battle of Hoher-Moc were 76 dead and 408 wounded. The Chinese and Black Flags are believed to have suffered casualties of around 1,000 dead and 2,000 wounded during the Siege of Tuyen Quang and the Battle of Hoher-Moc. The dead included 2 senior Chinese officers. The General Liu Jiagao, shot dead while leading a charge during the 4th Chinese assault on the 22nd of February, and Tan Jingde, one of Tang Jingsong's battalion commanders, who was also killed while leading an assault. Significance. In France, the defense of Tuyen Quang became the defining image of the Sino-French War. Domine's day-by-day diary of the siege was published in full in the Journal Officiel, and an order of the day issued by Briere de Lisle to the men of the Tuyen Quang garrison on 4 March 1885 enjoyed instant celebrity. Sous le commandement du chef héroïque, le chef de bataillon Domine, vous avez tenu tête pendant 36 jours, au nombre de 600. Et une armée acute, dans une bicoque dominée de toutes parts. Vous avez repoussé victorieusement cette sorte. Un tiers de votre effectif et presque tous vos officiers ont été brûlés par les mines ou frappés par les balles et les obus chinois, mais les cadavres de leur ennemi jonchent encore les 3 brèches qu'il l'événement fight so called a place. Aujourd'hui, vous faites l'admiration des braves troupes qui vous ont dégagés au prix de tant de fatigues et de sang versé. Demain, vous serez acclamés par la France entière. Vous tous aussi, vous pourrez dire avec orgueil. J'étais de la garnison de Tuyen Quang. J'étais sur la canonnière la mitrailleuse. The defense of Tuyen Quang holds a place second only to the Battle of Cameroon in the roll of battle honors of the Foreign Legion, and is commemorated in the first verse of Libadan, the Legion's celebrated marching song. O Tonkin, la Légion immortelle à Tuyen Quang illustre notre drapeau. The siege also reflected credit on Tang Jingsong's generalship and the professional skills of the Yunnan army. The Yunnan army contained a large number of officers and men who had learned the art of siege warfare under Marshal Ma Rulong, who crushed a Muslim insurrection in Yunnan in the early 1870s. Captain Jean-François Alphonse Lecomte, one of the more discerning officers of the Tonkin Expeditionary Corps, paid tribute to the skill the Yunnan army had shown in its siegecraft at Tuyen Quang. The Mandarins had directed the attack on Tuyen Quang in a very intelligent manner, owing to the Muslim insurrection in Yunnan, an insurrection that had nearly engulfed the entire province and was only put down by Marshal Ma after several sieges. They were now experts in the art of siegecraft. Their troops were excellent, and although they were unable to capture the fortress, defended as it was by a handful of heroes and relieved in the very nick of time by Giovanni Nolli's brigade, this siege was nonetheless a glorious feat of arms for the Celestials and showed that when necessary they could rise to the occasion.